Okay, so the next stage is actually finally fitting the handles and the handle supports, the vertical supports. By the last fitting at my mate's, what was quite clear was that business of finding the balance point, and it's not really that dramatic. Doesn't really make that much of a difference. What I'm going to do is, this is roughly the position that the handles are going to come. You know, it's quite wide without being too wide, and it's not too narrow where any excess weight here is going to cause an unbalance. So what I've done, excuse me, I got a cold. The whole length is 60, center line is 30. So what I've done is actually I'm mounting the handles halfway between. So in other words, it's 15 centimeters from each end is the center line for the vertical strut for the handles. So they're going to be, the verticals are going to be fixed in place with two M5 bolts and nuts. The head of the bolt is going to be on the inside and the nut on the outside. And I've already checked the height of the handles that the Garrett does indeed roll underneath as 0.1, and as 0.2 that the whole assembly actually goes into the case without fouling the lid of the case when it's shut. So I'll get on with that and I'll get back to you once that's done. So I just thought I'd give you a quick look at how I'm making sure that everything to do with the mounting of the handle is square. I've trimmed the base so that it's level according to the bubble, and to make sure this is the right height, that both uprights are exactly the same, you put the spirit level on the top here, and it's also level. Perhaps you can see it's level there as well. So both these uprights are the same height. When drilling all the holes, I clamped all the uprights together, so all the holes, they got drilled at the same time, so they all should be in exactly the same place. So I've taken the camera off the tripod just to show you that black line that you see in those two holes. That's the 15 centimeter from one end line, and it's obviously the same on the other side. So it's all lined up. So it's a question of marking off these holes, drilling the holes in the cradle base, and then that's done. And then doing the same obviously with the other handle. So the cradle handles are now fitted. They work fine. M5 bolts and nylock nuts on the outside. The excess bolt I've ground off, and the bolt is put in from the inside to keep this profile as small as possible, so that when the locomotive comes on, it's not going to foul, the bolt is not going to foul any part of the locomotive. So the next stage is to fit the sponge cushioning pieces to the end of the cradle, and that's quite a simple task. While I was at the final fitting session, I weighed up what I'm going to need, and this is that piece of sponge that you see in the picture. I'm going to cut through here, make 2 blocks to fit either side of the fastening, and then with some epoxy glue that onto the vertical face of the end stop. Obviously, because it's aluminium, we'll rough up the surface with some coarse sandpaper, degrease, and then put the epoxy on there. Okay, so there we are then. Foam sponge has been glued to this surface, and it's got enough give so that when the buffer from the Garrett comes along and gets put into the and gets hooked up, that there's no problem. So the Garrett locomotive cradle is now finished. I'd like to show you the very last job that I've done, and that is on the underside of the base. If some of you have been sharp-eyed and watched the other videos, you would have seen I'd actually mounted some felt to the underside in an attempt to stop the scratching, but unfortunately this felt is not as thick as some of these bolts. So what I've gone is for these rubber feet that are supposed to be for furniture, and these are just self-adhesive. They're just that little bit thicker than the thickest bolts, the aligning nuts, I should say. And we put it back, it sits fine, and it even steadies it on a smooth surface like this table. So my cradle is finished, my locomotive cradle, but the video is not finished. What I'd like to show you is the solutions that two of my friends came up with when making their Garrett locomotive cradles. So there's actually three of us making a locomotive cradle for a roundhouse D-class Garrett at the same time, and with all three of us are using the same base plate. So we've all got to achieve the same aim, but all three of us have taken a slightly different approach. So let's take a look at alternative solution number one. Okay, so here's Johan with his loco cradle, and he's actually used an aluminium L profile so that the wheels ride on that profile in a similar way that they ride on a track. So my solution, the wheels actually are, when the locomotive's in the cradle, the locomotive is actually resting on the flanges instead of on the wheel rims. And apart from that, it's quite similar. You see he's filed away at the edge to make the transition as easy as possible. And you see in the next picture with the Garrett on board, the buffer beam is quite high, which is just fine. In the next photo, you see how the locomotive is anchored in the cradle, and he's actually using a D-shackle, and he's got a couple of pieces of polystyrene on either side of the shackle housing to make sure that the locomotive does not get damaged if it happens to rock backwards or forwards. Okay, so this is Nico's solution. He's bolted a length of LGB straight track into the base plate of the cradle, and then he, using another piece of LGB track as a basis, he's actually made a transition piece. So it goes from the level of the track in the cradle down to the level of the track where the actual locomotive is. So if we look at that transition piece, if you look closely at the rail on the far side, you see there's a hook piece that hooks behind one of the sleepers, and that holds it steady. Quite an ingenious solution. And what this results in is actually you get the smoothest transition from the layout height to the cradle height using this method. So finally, the anchoring method then on the Nico solution, and as you can see, it's very similar to what I've got on my cradle, almost identical. I think that sponge that's there, that's not the actual finished product. He's just experimenting, and he'll put some new sponge in there, I'm sure, to keep the tension on that coupling.